Okay, hi guys. So I'm going to start reading from the story of King Arthur and his knights. To finish up this book, I will just do the rest of the readings. Um, I'm starting in part 2, chapter 2nd. How King Arthur fought with the Sable Knight, and how he was sorely wounded. Likewise, how Merlin brought him safe away from the field of battle. So King Arthur and Merlin rode together through the forest for a considerable while, until they perceived that they must be approaching nigh to the place where dwelt the Sable Knight, whom the king sought so diligently. For the forest, which had till then been altogether a wilderness, very deep and mossy, began to show an aspect more thin and open, as though a dwelling place of mankind was close at hand. And after a while they beheld before them a violent stream of water that rushed through a dark and dismal glen. And likewise they perceived that across this stream of water there was a bridge of stone, and that upon the other side of the bridge there was a smooth and level lawn of green grass, whereon knights contestants might joust very well. And beyond this lawn they beheld a tall and forbidding castle, with smooth walls and a straight tower. And this castle was built upon the rocks, so that it appeared to be altogether a part of the stone. So they wist that this must be the castle whereof the page and Sir Griflet had spoken. For midway upon the bridge they beheld that there hung a sable shield and a brass maul, exactly as the page and Sir Griflet had said, and that upon the farther side of the stream was an apple tree, amid the leaves which hung very great many shields of various devices, exactly as these two had reported. And they beheld that some of those shields were clean and fair, and that some were foul and stained with blood, and that some were smooth and unbroken, and that some were cleft as though by battle of knight with knight. And all those shields were the shields of different knights, whom the Sable Knight, who dwelt within the castle, had overthrown in combat with his own hand. Sorry, guys. Splendor of paradise, quoth King Arthur, that must indeed be a right valiant knight, who, with his own single strength, hath overthrown and cast down so many other knights. For indeed, Merlin, there must be 100 shields hanging in yonder tree. Unto this Merlin made reply, and thou, Lord, mayest be very happy, and thy shield too hangeth not there ere the sun goeth down this eventide. That, said King Arthur, with a very steadfast countenance, shall be as God willeth. For certes I have a greater mind than ever for to try my power against yonder knight. For consider what especial honor would fall to me should I overcome so valiant a warrior as this same sable champion appeareth to be, seeing that he hath been victorious over so many other good knights. Thereupon, having so spoken his mind, King Arthur immediately pushed forward his horse, and so, coming upon the bridge, he clearly read that challenge writ in letters of red beneath the shield. Whose swiftest this shield doeth so at his peril. Upon reading these words, the king seized his brazen maul and smote the shield so violent a blow that the sound thereof echoed back from the smooth walls of the castle, and from the rocks whereon it stood, and from the skirts of the forest around about, as though 12 other shields had been struck in those several places. And in answer to that sound, the portcullis of the castle was immediately let fall, and there issued forth a knight, very huge of frame, and clad all in sable armor. And likewise all of his apparel and all of the trappings of his horse were entirely of sable, so that he presented a most grim and forbidding aspect. And this sable knight came across that level meadow of smooth grass with a very stately and honorable gait, for neither did he ride in haste, nor did he ride slowly, but with great pride and haughtiness of mind. as became a champion who, haply, had never yet been overcome in battle. So reaching the bridgehead, he and also right he sorry he drew rein and saluted King Arthur with great dignity. Why didst thou, having read those words yonder inscribed, smite upon my shield? Now I do tell thee, shield away from thee. I'm sorry, I keep messing up, guys. Now I do tell thee that for thy discourtesy I shall presently take thy shield away from thee, and shall hang it upon yonder apple tree, where thou beholdest all those other shields to be hanging. Wherefore either deliver thou thy shield unto me without more ado, or else prepare for to defend it with thy person, in which event thou shalt certainly suffer great pain and discomfort in thy body. Gramercy for the choice thou grantest me, said King Arthur. But as for taking away my shield, I do believe that shall be a heaven willeth, and not as thou willest. Know thou, unkind knight, that I have come hither for no other purpose than to do battle with thee, and so to endeavor for to redeem with my person all those shields that hang yonder upon thy apple tree. So make thou ready straightway, that I may have to do with thee, maybe to thy great disadvantage. That will I so, replied the sable knight. And thereupon he turned his horse's head, and riding back a certain distance across the level lawn, he took stand in such a place as appeared to him to be convenient. And so did King Arthur ride forth also upon that lawn, and take his station as seemed to him to be convenient. Then each knight dressed his spear and his shield for the encounter, and having thus made ready for the assault, each shouted to his war horse and drave his spurs into its flank. Then those two steeds rushed forth like lightning, coursing across the ground with such violent speed that the earth trembled and shook beneath them, and it were by cause of an earthquake. So those two knights met fairly in the midst of the center of the field, crashing together like a thunderbolt, and so violently did they smite the one against the other that the spears burst into splinters, even unto the guard and the tourniquet thereof. And the horses of the riders staggered back from the onset, so that only because of the extraordinary address of the knight's rider did they recover from falling before that shock of meeting. But with great spirit these two knights uplifted each his horse with his own spirit, and so completed his course in safety. And indeed King Arthur was very much amazed that he had not overthrown his opponent, for at that time, as aforesaid, he was considered to be the very best knight, and the one of the best approved in deeds of arms that lived in all of Britain. Wherefore he marveled at the power and the address of that knight against whom he had driven, that he had not been overthrown by the greatness of the blow that had been delivered against his defenses. So, when they met again in the midst of the field, King Arthur gave that knight greeting, and bespoke him with great courtesy, addressing him in this wise: Sir Knight, I know not who thou art, but I do pledge my knightly word that thou art the most potent knight that I have ever met in all of my life. Now I do bid thee get down straightway from thy horse, and let us two fight this battle with sword and upon foot, for it were pity to let it end in this way. Not so, quoth the sable knight, not so, nor until one of us twain be overthrown will I so contest this battle upon foot. And upon this he shouted, Ho, ho, in a very loud voice, and straightway thereupon the gateway of the castle opened, and there came running forth two tall esquires, clad all in black, pied with crimson. And each of these esquires bare in his hand a great spear of ashwood, new and well seasoned, and never yet strained in battle. So King Arthur chose one of those spears, and the sable knight took the other, and thereupon each returned to their station, wherefrom he had been before essayed the encounter. Then once again each knight rushed his steed to the assault, and once again did each smite so fairly in the midst of the defense of the other that the spears were splintered, so that only the guard and the truncheon thereof remained in the grasp of the knight who held it. Then, as before, King Arthur, who had fought the battle out with swords and upon foot, but again the Sable Knight would not have it so, but called aloud upon those within the castle, whereupon there immediately came forth two other esquires with fresh new spears of ash wood. So each knight again took him a spear, and having armed himself therewith, chose each of his station upon that fair level lawn of grass. And now for the third time, having thus prepared themselves thereof, those two excellent knights hurled themselves together in furious assault. And now as twice before, King Arthur strike the Sable Knight so fairly in the center of the defense that the spear which he held was burst into splinters. But this time the spear of the Sable Knight did not so break in that manner, but held, and so violent was the blow that he delivered upon King Arthur's shield, that he pierced through the center of it. Then the girths of the king's saddle burst apart by that great powerful blow, and both he and his steed were cast violently backward. So King Arthur might have been overcast, had he not voided his saddle with extraordinary skill and knightly address, wherefore, though his horse was overthrown, he himself still held his footing and did not fall into the dust. Natheless, so violent was the blow that he received that, for a little space, he was altogether bereft of his senses, so that everything whirled around before his eyes. But when his sight returned to him, he was filled with an anger so vehement that it appeared to him as though all the blood in his heart rushed into his brains, so that he saw naught but red as of blood before his eyes. And when this also had passed, he perceived the Sable Knight, that he had sat his horse at no great distance. Then immediately King Arthur ran to him, and catching the bridle rein of his horse, he cried aloud unto that Sable Knight with great violence, "Come down, thou black knight, and fight me upon foot and with thy sword." "That will I not do," said the Sable Knight, "for lo, I have overthrown thee. Wherefore deliver thou to me thy shield, that I may hang it upon yonder apple tree, and go thy way as others have done before thee." "That will I not," cried King Arthur with exceeding passion. "Neither will I yield myself nor go hence until either thou or I altogether conquer the other." Thereupon he thrust the horse of the Sable Knight backward by the bridle rein so vehemently that the other was constrained to void his saddle to save himself from being overthrown upon the ground. And now each knight was entirely furious as the other, wherefore each drew his sword and dressed his shield, and thereupon rushed together like two wild bulls in battle. They foined, they smote, they traced, they parried, they struck again and again, and the sound of their blows, crashing and clashing, the one upon the other, filled the entire surrounding space with an extraordinary uproar. Not may any man altogether conceive of the entire fury of that encounter, for because of the violence of the blows which the one delivered upon the other, who cantels of armor were hewn from their bodies, and many deep and grievous wounds were given and received, so that the armor of each was altogether stained with red because of the blood that flowed down upon it. At last, King Arthur, waxing as it were entirely mad, struck so fierce a blow that no armor could have withstood that stroke had it fallen fairly upon him. But it befell with that stroke that his sword broke at the hilt, and the blade thereof flew into three several pieces into the air. Yet was the stroke so wonderfully fierce that the Sable Knight groaned and staggered, and ran about in a circle as though he had gone blind and knew not whither to direct his steps. But presently he recovered himself again, and perceiving King Arthur standing by, And not knowing that his enemy had now no sword for to defend himself withal, he cast aside his shield and took his own sword into both hands, and therewith smote so dolorous a stroke that he clave through King Arthur's shield and through his helmet, and even to the bone of his brain pan. Then King Arthur thought that he had received his death wound, for his brain swam like water, his thighs trembled exceedingly, and he sank down to his knees, whilst the blood and sweat, coming led together in the darkness of his helmet, flowed down into his eyes in a lather and blinded him. Thereupon, seeing him thus grievously hurt, the Sable Knight called upon him with great vehemence for to yield himself and to surrender his shield, because he was now too sorely wounded for to fight any more. But King Arthur would not yield himself, but catching the other by the sword belt, he lifted himself to his feet. Then, being a manner recovered from his amazement, he embraced the other with both arms, and placing his knee behind the thigh of the Sable Knight, he cast him backward down upon the ground so violently that the sound of the fall was astounding to hear. And with that fall, the Sable Knight was a while entirely bereft of consciousness. The King Arthur straightway unlaced the helm of the Sable Knight, and so beheld his face, and he knew him in spite of the blood that still ran down from his countenance in great quantities, and he knew that knight was King Pellinore, aforenamed in this history, who had twice warred against King Arthur. It hath already been said how King Arthur had driven the other king from the habitations of men and into the forest, so that now he dwelt in this poor gloomy castle, whence he waged war against all the knights who came unto this place. Now when King Arthur beheld whom it was against him he had done battle, he cried aloud, "Ha, Pellinore! It is then thou. Now yield thee to me, for thou art entirely at my mercy." And upon this he drew his misericordia and set the point thereof at King Pellinore's throat. But by now King Pellinore had greatly recovered from his fall, and perceiving that the blood was flowing down in great measure from out of his enemy's helmet, he wist that other must have been very sorely wounded by the blow which he had just received. Wherefore he catched King Arthur's wrist in his hand and directed the point of the dagger away from his own throat, so that no great danger threatened him therefrom. And indeed, what with his sore wound and with the loss of blood, King Arthur was now fallen exceedingly sick and faint, so that it appeared to him that he was nigh to death. Accordingly, it was with no great ado that King Pellinore suddenly heaved himself up from the ground, and so overthrew his enemy that King Arthur was now underneath his knees. And by this King Pellinore was exceedingly mad with the fury of the sore battle he had fought, for he was so enraged that his eyes were all beshot with blood like these of a wild boar, and a fourth, like the champings of wild boar, stood in the beard about his lips. Wherefore he wrenched the dagger out of the enemy's hands, and immediately began to unlace his helm, with intent to slay him where he lay. But at this moment Merlin came in great haste, crying out, "Stay, stay, Sir Pellinore! What would you be at? Stay your sacrilegious hand! For he who lieth beneath you is none other than Arthur, king of all this realm." At this King Pellinore was astonished beyond measure, and for a little he was silent, and then after a while he cried out in a very loud voice, "Say you so, old man? Then verily your words have doomed this man unto death, for no one in all this world hath ever suffered such ill and such wrongs as I have suffered at his hands. For lo, he hath taken from me power and kingship and honors and estates, and hath left me only this gloomy dismal castle of the forest as an abiding place. Wherefore, seeing that he is thus in my power, he shall now presently die, if for no other reason than because if I now let go free, he will certainly revenge himself when he shall have recovered from all the ill he has suffered at my hands." Then Merlin said, Not so, he shall not die at thy hands, for I myself shall save him. Whereupon he uplifted his staff and smote King Pellinore across the shoulders. Then immediately King Pellinore fell down and lay upon the ground on face like one who had suddenly gone dead. Upon this, King Arthur uplifted himself upon his elbow and beheld his enemy lying there as though dead, and he cried out, Ha, Merlin, what is this that thou hast done? I am very sorry, for I do perceive that thou, by thy arts of magic, hast slain one of the best knights in all the world. Not so, my lord king, said Merlin, for in sooth I tell thee that thou art far nigher than thy death than he, for he is but in sleep and will soon awaken. But thou art in such a case that it would take only a very little for no cause thee to die. And indeed King Arthur was exceedingly sick, even to the heart, with the sore wound he had received, so that it was only with much ado that Merlin could help him upon his horse. Having done that which, and having hung the king's shield upon the horn of his saddle, Merlin straightway conveyed that wounded man thence across the bridge, and, leading the horse by the bridle, so took him away into the forest. Now I must tell you that there was in that part of the forest a certain hermit, so holy that the wild birds of the woodland would come and rest upon his hand, whiles he read his breviary, and so sanctified was he in gentleness that the wild does would come even to the door of his hermitage, and there stand whilst he milked them for his refreshment. And this hermit dwelt in that part of the forest so remote from the habitations of man that when he rang the bell for matins or vespers, there was hardly ever any one to hear the sound thereof, excepting the wild creatures that dwelt thereabout. Yet nevertheless, to this remote and lonely place, royal folk and other high degree would sometimes come, as though on a pilgrimage, because of the hermit's exceeding saintliness. So Merlin conveyed King Arthur unto the sanctuary, and having reached that place, he and the hermit lifted the wounded man down from his saddle, and the hermit giving many words of pity and sorrow, and together they conveyed him unto the holy man's cell. There they laid upon a couch of moss, and unlaced his armor, and searched his wounds, and bathed them with pure water, and dressed his hurts, for that hermit was a very skillful leech. So for all that day and part of the night, King Arthur lay upon the hermit's pallet like one about to die, for he beheld all things about him as though through thin water. And the breath hung upon his lips and fluttered, and he could not even lift his head from the pallet because of the weakness that lay upon him. Now upon the afternoon of the second day there fell a great noise and tumult in the part of the forest. For it happened that the Lady Guinevere of Cameliard, together with her court, both of ladies and of knights, had come upon a pilgrimage to that holy man, the fame of whose saintliness had reached even upon the place where she dwelt. For that lady had a favorite page who was very sick of a fever, and she trusted that that holy man might give her some charm or amulet by the virtue of which he might haply be cured. Wherefore she had come to that place with her entire court, so that all that part of the forest was made gay with fine raiment, and the silence thereof was made merry with the sound of talk and laughter, and the singing of songs, and the chattering of many voices, and the neighing of horses. And that Lady Guinevere rode in the midst of her damsels in her court, and her beauty outshone the beauty of her damsels, as the splendor of the morning star outshines that of all the lesser stars that surround it. For then and afterwards she was held by all the courts of chivalry to be the most beautiful lady in the world. Now when the Lady Guinevere had come to that place, she perceived the milk-white war-horse of King Arthur, where it stood cropping the green grass of the open glade nigh to the hermitage. And likewise she perceived Merlin, where he stood beside the door of the cell. So of him she demanded whose was that noble war horse that stood browsing upon the grass at that lonely place, and who was it that lay within the cell? And unto her Merlin made the answer, Lady, he who lieth within is a knight, very sorely wounded, so that he is sick nigh unto death. Pity of heaven, cried Lady Guinevere. What a sad thing is that thou tellest me. Now I do beseech thee to lead me presently unto that knight, that I may behold him. For I have in my court a very skillful leech, who is well used to cure the hurts of such knights receive in battle. So Merlin brought the lady into the cell, and there she beheld King Arthur, where he lay stretched upon the pallet. And she wist not who he was, yet it appeared to her that in all her life she had not beheld so noble appearing a knight as he was, who lay sorely wounded in that lonely place. And King Arthur cast his looks upon to where she stood beside his bed of pain, surrounded by her maidens, and in the great weakness that lay upon him, and he wist not whether she whom he beheld was a mortal lady, or whether she was not rather some tall straight angel who had descended from one of the lordly courts of paradise for to visit him in his pain and distresses. And the Lady Guinevere was filled with a great pity at beholding King Arthur's sorrowful estate. Wherefore she called to her that skillful leech who was with her court, and she bade him bring a certain alabaster box of exceedingly precious balsam. And she commanded him for to search the knight's wounds, and to anoint them with the balsam, so that he might be healed of his hurts with all dispatch. So that wise and skillful leech did according to the Lady Guinevere's commands, and immediately King Arthur felt entire ease of all his aches and great content of spirit. And when the lady and her court had departed, he found himself much uplifted in heart. And 3 days thereafter he was entirely healed, and as well and strong and lusty as ever he had been in his whole life. And this was the first time that King Arthur ever beheld the beautiful lady, the Lady Guinevere of Cameliard. And from the time forth he never forgot her, but she was almost always present in his thoughts. Wherefore, when he was recovered, he said thus to don't push it himself, I will forget that I am king, and I will cherish the thought of this lady, and will serve her faithfully as a good knight may serve his chosen dame. And so he did, as ye shall hear later in this book. Okay, guys, so that was the second chapter in part 2. Okay. And just do the narration in your notebooks, guys. And it doesn't have to be great detail. It's just like a summary, you know, of basically what we just read, what you guys just listened to. By the way, every time I was saying leech, a leech is what they called doctors in the Middle Ages. I don't know if I already mentioned that to you guys, but they kept referring the leech of Lady Guinevere's leech. That was like a physician. Okay, guys, so that's it. I will see you guys Tuesday. Blessings.